Get going. Let me introduce Dr. Faith Gordon, who is our first keynote speaker of today. Really pleased to have you here, Faith. The senior lecturer in law at the Australian National University in the College of Law there. She's also director of the Interdisciplinary International Youth Justice Network, which she established herself in 2016. She's got a wealth of expertise. Do have a look at her bio in the programme, which is on the Euromet website. But she's got expertise in youth justice, media representations, children's rights, criminal law, digital technology, regulation and privacy law, and has held various sort of positions across different universities, including Oxford University, UCL and Queen's University. And she's currently undertaking research on behalf of Catch-22, looking specifically at online harms and young people. So I'm going to hand over to Faith in a minute, but just to say, if you do have any questions or comments as Faith is speaking, please type them into the stage Q&A box, and I will put them to Faith at the end of her session. And you can upvote questions as well, as a little thumbs up icon when someone asks a question, if you think that's a particularly good question and you'd like to see it answered. Okay, definitely enough from me now. I'm going to hand over to you, Faith.
Thanks so much, Melissa. I'm based in Australia, as Melissa said, so I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the lands in which I live and work, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and note that sovereignty of these lands were never ceded. So thank you so much to Catch-22 for the opportunity to present on the research today. Digital by default is a phrase that many of you may have heard of. It certainly is representative of many children and young people's experiences during the pandemic. All aspects of their lives now have been by default online and in the digital space. So today's keynote presentation, I'd like to touch on 5 key points. The COVID-19 context, the construction of risk and harm, the importance and the value of young people's voices and participation in all of the ongoing debates at the moment, a point about regulation not being a panacea. There are many other aspects for us to consider and think about when we think about online harms and moving forward. And also what kind of rights-based approach offered to us as part of these discussions and frameworks. So in relation to the UK, a new regulatory framework for online companies to target a range of illegal or harmful content affecting users has been part of a discussion for quite a number of years now in the UK. The proposed online safety bill that was proposed in 2021, so this year, is said to bring effect to ending self-regulation and placing legal and practical responsibility on online companies. There have been a number of measures also in Europe. The European Commission has released back in December 2020 the Digital Services Act package. And the UK Digital Markets Task Force has made recommendations for a new regime in the UK to govern the behaviour of digital firms with market power. In the context of media discourse, many of you will probably be aware of how much focus there has been in the mainstream media in relation to these debates and discussions. During the pandemic, we've seen a huge focus in mainstream media on child sexual exploitation and grooming, and there have been a lot of reports about social media companies and their responsibilities. And we have seen various NGOs and charities presenting their opinions on how best children and young people can be protected, but also that their participation continues to be key, really. Children do have the right to participate online, but in safe environments. The COVID-19 pandemic context, we've seen more than 1.5 billion children and young people being affected by school closures worldwide, as reported by UNICEF. There's been increased time spent online on various different platforms, And as many researchers working in this space have highlighted, this can leave children open to various online sexual exploitation and grooming. The Internet Watch Foundation has reported that in the 11 weeks from the 23rd of March 2020, its phone line in the UK logged 44,809 reports of images, compared with 29,698 the previous year. I should also say that we do know that there is an underreporting, and this just represents what is actually being reported. And the UK Home Office data illustrates that 17,699 online sexual offences recorded by the police in England and Wales between April and September 2020 demonstrated an increase of over 15,000 for the same period in the previous year. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exposed various structural inequalities, and it has exacerbated systemic issues for children and young people, particularly the most marginalised. And the Secretary General of the United Nations has suggested that the COVID-19 pandemic has quickly turned into a much broader crisis in relation to children's rights. Catch-22 launched a survey back in June 2020, and that survey received responses from young people, from frontline professionals, from tech platforms, and from commissioners on the challenges of online harms. The findings of that survey found that more than 70% of young people had seen content online that they found concerning. They referred in their responses to viewing specific violent content and explicit content. And also, alarmingly, only 40% of young people reported online harms to the platforms that they were using. So Catch-22 wanted to find out more about what young people's experiences were, and also to include much younger children in these discussions. They commissioned the research that I'm going to talk about today to explore children and young people's experiences of online platforms, social media platforms, apps and gaming platforms. Also to try and gather children and young people's experiences of online harms and the direct impact that those had on their lives. Also, children and young people's perceptions of what acceptable use is in online spaces, their views of policing and law enforcement's role in addressing online harms, and also their views on what future regulatory frameworks and arrangements they felt should be developed. So it's really important, as we know, that, and I'm sure in the work that you all do in your particular roles, that young people's voices are important to have at the centre of all of the discussions and the debates that we have about issues that affect their lives. And it's important to seek out, to record, to champion, and to truly value those children and young people's perspectives and the experiences of the most marginalised, as well as us considering how power operates in society, can really help to bring about social change. And I've written about that in the context of mainstream media representations of children, particularly those in conflict with the law. And I really feel that that is also at the key of these discussions that we have about online harms. A person that I interviewed from the tech industry actually said that exploring online harms, they felt that it was probably best done in a qualitative sense, so actually speaking to children and young people directly, and working with organisations that work with children to better understand what the challenges are and how they can be addressed. And that's exactly what Catch-22 have provided, that platform to be able to do this research. The research itself involved working very closely with a youth advisory group and developing qualitative interview questions for children and young people, and also professionals working in a range of industries and professions. It also involved holding an online findings event and panel session that discussed those preliminary findings and that engaged with young people and experts. And it enabled young people to have that space to actually question key people and key roles, such as the Victims Commissioner in the UK. And there was also an analysis of quantitative data on referrals and service provision from the first 3 quarters pre-pandemic of 2019 and also 2020, so during the pandemic, and in particular during the lockdowns that the UK have experienced. And that compared the nature and also the volume of victim support services referrals and referrals to other related services. So focus groups and interviews were conducted with 42 children and young people aged 10 to 22 years. And those children and young people, many of whom were service users, do represent some of the most marginalised voices in our society. 15 qualitative interviews were conducted with key stakeholders and professionals, including senior police, educators, safeguarding experts, youth workers, victim service providers, tech and gaming companies, regulators, and also representatives from the wider tech industry. And as I mentioned, the study also involved analysis of quantitative data. So there's a link just to flag up that you may like to watch at a later date, the interim findings from the review research. And as I mentioned, a young person led several aspects of the questioning of the panel, so it may be of interest to you all to watch at another stage. So in the research, children and young people said that they all overwhelmingly said that their use of online platforms for education purposes, for socialising and for education had all been increased quite dramatically during the lockdowns, and they all said that they were spending much more time online. They referred to checking in with their screen usage on their phones as being a constant reminder just of how much more time they were spending. They also said that online platforms offered many positives to their lives, such as communicating with friends, keeping in contact with people in other places. So they mentioned having moved towns and cities, for educational purposes and also for finding new hobbies. And many young people felt that online platforms gave them that sense of belonging as feeling part of a community. Some young people reported feeling that it was much easier to actually talk to people online rather than in person, and that had assisted them with their participation. So there were many positives to their use of online spaces. The focus groups directed by the young people, most of our time was spent on talking about the negative consequences of online spaces. So children and young people spoke at length about their experiences online and those negative consequences, often for their mental health. So they talked about experiences of cyberbullying, of receiving threats and harassment, and unwanted contact and unwanted content were all labelled as being quite negative for their mental health. They talked a lot about the toxic nature of interactions that they'd had online, the lack of boundaries, and the nature of restrictions for adults and young people, as well as the levels of surveillance. And these were identified as some of the key negative aspects that they associated with their time online. So COVID-19, as you will note there from some of the media content that I posted on an earlier slide, there is this sense that COVID-19 and the pandemic, particularly the lockdowns, have heightened the concept of risk of harm for children and young people on online spaces. In the focus groups, it was quite clear that children and young people felt that there are a number of grey areas when it comes to what actually harm is. And many young people felt that it's also quite subjective. So something that they may feel is quite alarming and distressing for them, a peer may not feel that way about the situation. There are a number of grey areas that children and young people felt had not been addressed, whether that would be in their education programmes that they received in school or their interactions with adults when they talked about these issues. They also felt that there was a blurring of online and offline, and they talked about when things slightly opened up again, schooling-wise, how online and offline behaviour seemed to blur into one. They talked a lot about the limited redress that they felt that online platforms either provided an automated response, which was not personalised, or they didn't hear back from platforms, or they weren't actually sure how to make a complaint. And they felt that there was definitely a sense of limited resources for aftercare support should they require support. This was something that the professionals in the interviews also highlighted. There were huge increases in the referrals of young people, children and young people requiring support. And this support often lasted for well over a year to a year and a half, as reported by victim support services. And it was deemed that there is definitely a limited bank of resources and more funding needed to be directed towards those services. So my second key aspect is the voices of children and young people. Children and young people reported feeling that they hadn't been actually asked about their experiences online, but they had a lot to say about what they were experiencing online and also about possible solutions. So as one young person said, I don't think I know one person who hasn't had something bad go on online. The prevalence of children and young people's experiences of online harms was something that they talked about a lot. And this is something that is a key aspect of their experiences. And they felt that the COVID-19 pandemic had really brought this to the fore in terms of just how much they were experiencing online, given that all of these aspects of their lives had reverted to being online. Children and young people felt that there was really no way for them to actually control the content, where their content goes, for example. So they also talked about, when something is shared, just how quickly it can be viewed and reshared. So as one focus group said, if a video or a picture has been uploaded onto the internet, as soon as that goes on there, there's millions of people that can see it. And they can always save it and they can share it to another platform. So it will never go away properly. It will always be there. In the focus groups, there were several examples that young people referred to in relation to this sharing and resharing. And that included some of the most distressing content that young people talked about. That included videos of people self-harming, and suicide. And they talked a lot about the responsibility of the platforms in relation to removal of content, but also ensuring that that content isn't reshared on other platforms. They talked a lot about not being able to unsee what they had been able to see. And young people also talked a lot about unwanted contact. They mentioned about having been contacted by adults posing as children. And they also talked a lot about the safety mechanisms in relation to platforms and this emphasis that there is on age verification, which many children and young people talked about how they and their peer group navigate their way around those mechanisms, which they felt were very ineffective. Children and young people had a lot of advice, and this was often based on their own experiences. Those young people who had younger siblings talked a lot about actually playing a key role in monitoring what their younger sibling was doing online or what they were being exposed to online. And they talked a lot about actually playing a role in assisting younger siblings to make complaints. They talked a lot about the importance of trusted persons, and they really felt that all children and young people should be encouraged to speak to someone that they trust. They said that things should be monitored with respect for privacy. They noted and wanted monitoring of content, but they felt that they should also have their own privacy respected. They felt that there should be more education for them, but also for adults. And they felt that parents and guardians and carers should receive much more education on online harms and risks and approaches to support children and young people. They felt that the design and the delivery of that education should be very children and young people centred and focused, and that they should be part of the design and also the implementation of these education programmes. They felt that education in schools needed to be updated, and they needed to keep up with the changing nature of online platforms. They felt that there was much more to learn from peer-to-peer learning. They placed huge responsibility on the platforms themselves. They felt that platforms should be taking responsibility. They should act promptly and should employ the technology that they have for social good in actually making the platforms safer for everyone. They felt that in particular, platforms, and that included gaming companies and their responsibilities, they should be giving children and young people more information about how to make a complaint, but also that people should be given warnings, and if they have done something wrong, that they should be held accountable. The youth voice was central to the methods that were used in this research, but it was very key that children and young people wanted more opportunities to actually speak about what they have been experiencing, but also to play a really vital part in bringing into fruition some of the solutions. And they wanted to be asked by tech companies about what was bad about their platforms and their products. They wanted to be engaged on youth panels in a meaningful way. And they felt that, whether it be safety by design or designing the platforms, they felt this should be an ongoing process. And they felt that their social group should be at the centre of that, and they are best placed to know how to make things safe for them. Youth engagement was a key theme that emerged, and this also came into lots of discussions with the professionals, including law enforcement and the police, safeguarding officers, victim support. There were a number of key themes that emerged in these discussions as well. There was a huge need for more increased information sharing, much more tailored education and learning. Many police and law enforcement that I spoke to felt that programmes such as Catch-22's The Social Switch Project should be rolled out and compulsory for all those that are working in law enforcement. And they also felt that not only the design of the platforms process, but the actual reporting processes should be much more visible to children and young people, and should be presented in child and young people friendly formats. Another key aspect of the findings was that there is a huge need for ongoing research that does keep up with the new and emerging harms in technology. And there is a key need for platforms to actually be open and transparent to having engagements with independent researchers. Regulation itself has been the huge focus of the debates and the discussions in the UK, but in itself, it's not a panacea. There are many, many other aspects for us to think about. Having a regulatory framework and legislation is a very central and a key move for the UK to make. But also we need to look at the types of issues that children and young people are reporting. For example, grooming throughout society for many, many decades. We know that children have experienced grooming in their communities. Now we see versions of this online evolving and emerging as various platforms and technology emerges and evolves. But that key issue has been around for quite some time, for example. So we need to be looking, beyond the regulatory space as well, to looking at, very much at the heart of these issues in society that have been around for such a long time. So it's much, much broader. The technology is being used to facilitate this, and regulation is one aspect that would be useful in actually drawing boundaries and holding companies to account. But greater education and the position of children in society are much bigger issues as well to be exploring. Children themselves talked a lot about, as I mentioned, the reporting process, and they wanted things to be much swifter and simpler. And in relation to my kind of last point that I want to make is that there is a rights framework in relation to the international mechanisms that we have. The UK signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We need to be looking at the international instruments and what they offer. There is a lack of a rights-based discourse in a lot of the debates and the discussions that we're having in relation to online harms. Yet children and young people are afforded many rights within the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Committee on the Rights of the Child launched a general comment in March of this year, and it was focused on children's rights in the digital environment. And this emerged from a discussion day that focused on children's rights. Children and the digital age, children's rights and the Convention of 1989, long before children were using online platforms, it was very key, the committee felt, to actually have a general comment that explored in much more detail the implications of the online world for the rights of children. And harm has actually been mentioned on a number of occasions in this general comment document. And I'd just like to make reference to some of the mentions now and how we can use this framework to better protect, but also ensure that children's participation is not, as in other work I've done, we've referred to not being eclipsed by this notion of children's vulnerability. So as the general comment mentioned, state parties should involve the national and local bodies that oversee the fulfilment of the rights of children in various actions. In concerning the best interest of the child, they should have regard for all children's rights, and that includes their rights to seek and receive and impart information, to be protected from harm, and to have their views given due weight, and also to ensure transparency in the assessment of the best interests of the child and the criteria that have been applied. So what's really key is getting that balance right between the protection and the participation of children. And as I mentioned in other work that I've done with colleagues, we made this conclusion in a piece that it's quite important that the protection doesn't overtake or overshadow the participation rights that children have. It is a balance that needs to be struck. The committee have also said that the use of digital devices should not be harmful, nor should it be a substitute for children and young people being afforded in-person interactions. They talk as well about the training and advice on the appropriate use of digital devices should actually be given to a wide range of actors that engage with children, ranging from parents and caregivers to educators and other relevant actors. And that should take into account research on the effects of digital technologies on children's development, especially during that early childhood and adolescence stage. And they mentioned that programs should involve information on how children can benefit from digital products and services and develop their digital literacy skills, how to protect children's privacy and prevent victimisation, and how to recognise a child who is a victim of harm perpetrated online or offline and respond appropriately. And those programs should be informed by research and consultations with children, parents and caregivers. Now, a number of the highlighted parts on these slides really closely align to what children and young people told us that they wanted to see this in their own lives and their own experiences, whether that be in school or alternative education programs. They felt that children and their experiences should be at the centre of developing those and also implementing them. And the last point that I'd like to make about the new general comment is that there is a discussion about how children's data is being used. And children and young people in the focus groups for this research talked a lot about how their data is being, farmed and fielded from their profiles and being used. And it was something that they felt that they wanted and needed more education on. They also felt that platforms should present the information to them in a much more condensed and concise way. This is something that the National Children's Commissioner in the UK, her research identified a number of years ago. Yet, as children and young people reported in our research, there seems to be very little development in that space. And the commercially driven content that young people talked about being pushed towards them was something that also the UN committee have highlighted in the general comment. And they've talked about that processing of children's personal data can also result in violations and abuses of children's rights. The Children's Rights Framework offers a very key framework for us to use. Children have quite clear rights, and children and young people spoke a lot about their right to privacy, their right to participate, their right to be heard on issues that concern them. Yet they felt that the current discussions and debates didn't afford them much opportunity or space to be actually talking about their experiences. So I'd like to just end here with a quote from a young person who said that it's just not often that young people are asked about anything to do with them, which sucks. And this piece of research, at the very, very heart of it, was children and young people's experiences, their views on what could be done or put in place to make things better. But also they played a key role in constructing the questions for the professionals. Since the focus groups, this research has been presented, for example, to the Metropolitan Police and youth-focused officers, and young people made a number of suggestions about policing and law enforcement, which have been presented to the police. I think we have a duty to use the findings in the research to make sure that children and young people's voices are heard. I'd really appreciate any questions that you might have or comments about the research. It's such a short time slot to have to present such a big project, but I've just focused today on young people's voices and the importance of making sure that that's at the heart of all of the discussions and the debates, but also not forgetting that there is an international rights framework, and ensuring that children's rights remain at the centre is also a vitally important aspect that shouldn't be ignored.
Thank you, Faith. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to the full research coming out. And we've got a couple of minutes left, so if you don't mind, I'll put some questions to you, and I'll try and cluster them a little bit, because we've had quite a few on the social media companies themselves. So a comment here from a colleague in Finland saying social media companies are big international companies. One country can do little about regulation. The European Union is probably the one actor that can make a difference, as it has done in many other issues concerning big tech companies like data protection. So good point there. And then a question about social media companies. How do you think the social media giants will react to what you found?
Really, really great points and discussions. We know that the former Children's Commissioner has launched legal action in relation to companies. I do think that there is huge complication in relation to the international sphere, and we've seen here in Australia when our government here took some action in relation to Facebook, the ramifications for information and access that had. So it's hugely difficult. It's also very difficult in relation to getting access to the platforms. We were very fortunate that a number of platforms for this research were open to being interviewed. For example, I do feel that in relation to their responsibility and transparency, it's really important that those platforms are more open about their capability. There's a number of mechanisms and aspects of technology that we know that they have and use, and those could be pivoted and used actually for social good as well. So I think it's vitally important, as children and young people talked about, that they actually get an opportunity to speak directly, because I think that they're best placed to talk about what's impacting them, what doesn't work well for them on the platforms, what they'd like to see change. And I think that in other countries such as Australia, the Safety Commissioner's Office for quite some time now has been engaged with a number of companies to have almost like a charter where people have signed up and children are involved in that safety by design process. So I think we should be seeing hopefully more of that would be vitally important. And children have a lot to say on these issues. So providing them with that space and platform, I think the companies have a responsibility to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Faith. And I think that actually answers a couple of the questions on the social media companies. Let me just finish by asking you one, because you did mention this about sort of regulation and how far that can actually solve some of these problems. So the direct question is, realistically, do you see online harms issues actually being impacted by regulation?
I think it's a really important question. I think that, we've seen other forms of regulation. I've written quite a bit about the regulation of the mainstream media in relation to children and young people. Now, as many children and young people talked about in the focus groups, redress mechanisms are after the event has happened, after the issue has happened. And really, what sort of redress can that give to someone who has been harmed? So I actually feel that, regulation and outcomes, as we've seen with the mainstream media, whether that be a fine for the company, for example, can have very little impact. And children and young people report that they're not satisfied by that. Many children and young people also are very disillusioned by the reporting processes and choose not to report things. And they either withdraw themselves from the platform and therefore they don't get the benefit of interacting with it, or they don't complain and feel really that sense of not being listened to. So I think that those mechanisms, the individual platforms all each have their own unique, but I think that regulation linked with redress after the event often is not satisfactory for the victims.
No, absolutely. I'm going to put one more to you if you don't mind, because we've had some really interesting questions. And I would just like to say to anyone who doesn't have their question answered today, Faith, hopefully we'll be speaking at the official launch of the report in a couple of months' time. So do please come along to that, because there'll be opportunity to ask Faith more questions there. But just this one question here about what did the young people mean by a blurring of lines between social media and reality during COVID? Could you tell us a little more about this? And that might be quite a good way to end, because it's directly from the young people.
Yeah, sure. So this came up in quite a number of aspects, really. So they talked a lot about in between the lockdowns, when they returned to school briefly, that issues that had occurred online actually come up in person. They also talked a lot about, and this was in the context of a number of children and young people who had experienced contact with an adult that they didn't know online. Some of that had resulted in them meeting the person in person. And they also talked a lot about sort of how these issues can really become quite prevalent online. And then when they interact with peers, this is particularly in relation to cyberbullying, when they interact in person, it's very different. And they also said that there's a lot of things that people will do, including themselves online, that they wouldn't do offline, but mainly it related to, with reference to, you know, when schools returned in between lockdowns.
Yeah, really interesting. Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Faith. Fantastic to have you, and thank you for dialing in your evening. What's your evening time? Thank you to everyone who participated and asked questions. As I said, we will let you know when we're officially launching this research, so you can hopefully come along to that and send Faith a few more questions. But just to say now, we've got 10 minutes before the workshop start, so do grab yourself a drink and stretch your legs a little bit, and then head over to the left-hand side of your screens where it says sessions, and you will see the 6 or so workshops that we've got running, and they'll start at 10:30 promptly. Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you, Faith. See you soon.